When the chief's wife fell from her horse, her life was bleeding out into the dust. I wasn't a hero, just a man who knew how to set a bone and stitch a wound. When I finished, the chief promised my honor would be remembered. I thought that meant a horse or a safe passage. But as the moon rose high, the flap of my tent opened, and his daughter stood there, her silhouette framed by the campfire. "A life for a life," she said. "My mother's debt is now mine to pay." The year was 1878. The land was a harsh god, demanding sweat and blood as its tithe. For 10 years, Caleb Thorne had paid it faithfully. He was a man etched by the sun and sculpted by solitude, his face a roadmap of hard trails and harder memories. His home was a canvas tent and the leather of his saddle, his family the ghosts of a past he'd ridden 1,000 miles to forget. He was a trapper by trade, but had been a dozen other things before that, including for a short time a field medic's assistant in a war that had torn the nation and his own soul in two. It was a lifetime he never spoke of, a skill he had tried to bury, but the land, like a stubborn mule, remembered everything. He found her at the edge of the cottonwood grove, where the creek turned shallow. Her horse, a fine pinto, stood nearby, one leg held at an awkward angle. The woman was Apache, her station obvious from the intricate beadwork on her doe-skin dress and the silver bracelets on her wrists. She was older, her face lined with the wisdom of a matriarch, but now it was pale and slick with the sweat of agony. Her leg was twisted beneath her, the bone jutting out like a pale, horrifying branch. He knew what it meant. To interfere was to invite trouble that could follow him for 100 miles. To ride on was to leave a woman to die slowly, a sacrifice to the uncaring sun. He dismounted, his movement slow and deliberate, holding his hands out, palms open to show he meant no harm. The woman's dark eyes fixed on him, full of pain but devoid of fear. She was Sun Woman, wife of the great Chief Blackhawk, and she would not show a white man her fear even at the precipice of death. Caleb had seen that look before, in the eyes of colonels and privates alike. It was the look of someone refusing to surrender to their own broken body. He learned a long time ago that honor wasn't about the color of a man's skin, but the grit in his soul. Leaving her wasn't an option. He approached with the quiet patience of a man who tracks animals for a living. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. He didn't know if she understood his words, but she would understand his tone. He gestured to her leg, then to the medical satchel strapped to his horse. A flicker of understanding and then a grim nod. Permission. That was all he needed. Setting the bone was a brutal necessity. He gave her a strip of leather to bite down on, his own belt, and worked quickly, his hands sure and steady despite the grim task. She did not scream. A low guttural groan was her only concession to the fire that shot through her body. He admired her for that. He splinted the leg with branches from a cottonwood and strips of his own cleanest shirt. As he worked, he saw the warriors appear on the ridge above, silent as spirits, watching his every move. He didn't look up, focusing only on the task at hand. When he was done, they descended.
A chief spoke, his voice deep and resonant, the Apache words translated by a younger warrior who had learned English at a trading post. "You have saved the heart of my people. Sun Woman is the mother of our tribe. Her life is a debt we can never truly repay. My honor and the honor of my family demands that this act be remembered. You will be safe in our lands, and your reward will be great." Caleb shook his head. "I don't want a reward," he said plainly. "I saw a person in need. That's all." The chief's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in confusion. For a white man to refuse a gift was unheard of. It was a break in the sacred rhythm of debt and payment that governed his world. "Your humility is noted," the chief said finally. "But the debt remains. It will be honored." They gave him a tent of his own, away from the main camp, a place of polite, solitary confinement. They brought him food and fresh water. He was a guest, but also a puzzle they had not yet solved. For 2 days he rested, his own weary muscles aching. He had no desire to stay. The quiet hum of the community, the laughter of children, the soft murmur of families, it was all a reminder of a life he could never have, a wound in him that had never healed. On the 3rd night, he decided he would leave at dawn. He had done his part. The debt, in his world, was paid. The fire outside his tent had burned down to glowing embers. The moon was a sliver of silver in an ink-black sky, and the camp had fallen into a deep, trusting silence. He sat on his bedroll, his shirt hanging open in the heat of the small tent, cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of gun oil a small comfort. That is when the tent flap was pulled back. She stood there, a silhouette against the dying campfire. She was young, perhaps 18 summers, with the same proud features as her mother and the same unyielding eyes as the chief, her father. Her black hair was braided with eagle feathers, and the deerskin dress she wore did little to hide the graceful curves of her body. It was the chief's daughter. He'd seen her watching him from a distance, but had never spoken to her. She stepped inside, the lantern light catching the copper of her skin and the defiant pride in her eyes. She carried a small woven basket. For a long moment there was only the sound of the crickets outside and the frantic beating of his own heart. She walked to the center of the tent, knelt gracefully, and set the basket down. Then she looked directly at him, her gaze unwavering, and her voice was as soft as the desert wind, yet held the weight of a sacred vow. "A life for a life. My mother's debt is now mine to pay." They brought him to their camp. It was a place of vibrant life, nestled in a hidden canyon, shielded from the wind. He was an unwelcome guest, an intrusion of another world. The warrior's eyes were hard, their suspicion a palpable thing in the air, but they did not harm him. They led him to the largest teepee, where Chief Blackhawk waited. The chief was a man who seemed carved from the canyon rock itself, his presence radiating an authority that needed no words. He looked at Caleb, then at the splint on his wife's leg, and his expression was unreadable. Caleb simply stood, meeting his gaze. He had done what was right, and the consequences would be what they would be. In his experience, a man who worried too much about what might happen never did what must be done.
Caleb stared at her, the rifle heavy and cold in his hands. The air in the tent grew thick, charged with the unspoken meaning of her words. He had faced down grizzlies, outlaws, and the ghosts of his own past, but the quiet determination of this young woman struck him with a force that left him momentarily breathless. Her name, he would later learn, was Chaitin, which meant falcon, and her gaze was just as sharp and penetrating. He could see no fear in her, only a profound sense of duty that was as much a part of her as her own bones. "There's no debt to pay," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "Your mother is alive. That's all the payment I need." He felt a muscle jump in his jaw. This was a custom he didn't understand, a cultural chasm opening at his feet. After a decade of running, of keeping his soul locked down in a solitary, hardened peace, he was not prepared for this kind of complication. "Go back to your family," he urged, his tone softer than he intended. Chaitin did not move. "To refuse a gift of honor is to bring shame to my father and my people, and to me. You saved the matriarch.
The debt is a spiritual one. It cannot be erased with horses or furs. It requires a balancing. I am that balance. She opened the basket she had brought. Inside were poultices of crushed herbs and strips of clean linen. My mother is a leader. I am a healer. I will care for you until your spirit is as strong as the body you have lent us. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the deep lines of a man who had been alone for too long. Her duty was to her family, but her training as a healer made her see more than just the debt. She saw the wounds he carried within. This he could understand. It was not a carnal offering, but a spiritual one, a duty of care. Yet her presence was an intoxicating disturbance in his desolate world. Every night she would come, tending to the ache in his muscles, a strain from carrying her mother that he hadn't even noticed. She would share a meal with him in silence, the space between them filled with the fragile, growing respect. She spoke of her world, of the spirits and the rocks and the stories in the stars. He found himself listening, drawn in by the calm certainty in her voice. He spoke little of his own past, but she never pushed. She simply created a space where silence was not empty, but full of understanding. One evening, a week after her mother's accident, a commotion arose from the center of the camp. Shouts echoed through the canyon. A young brave, Eagle Talon, who had long desired Chayton for himself, stood before the chief's teepee, his face a mask of fury. He had seen Chayton leaving the white man's tent night after night. His pride, twisted by jealousy, saw not an act of honor, but of betrayal.
"The white man defiles your daughter," he roared, his voice carrying on the wind. "He has brought his poison into our camp, and you, my chief, allow it. He has cast a shadow on her spirit." Caleb heard the accusation from his tent. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to let them handle their own affairs. This was not his fight. But then he thought of Chayton, of her quiet dignity, and the undeserved shame being hurled at her. Before he could stop himself, he was walking toward the firelight, toward the conflict. He stepped into the circle of light. All eyes turned to him. Eagle Talon spat on the ground at his feet. "You see, he comes to claim her as his own." Chief Blackhawk rose, his face grim. "My daughter honors a sacred debt, Eagle Talon. Do not let your jealousy speak with a forked tongue." "It is not jealousy, but pride for our people," Eagle Talon shot back, pointing a finger at Caleb. "Let him prove his honor. Let him face me in the test of the stone. If his spirit is pure, the stone will show it. If he is a coward who hides behind a woman's care, it will break him." Caleb had no idea what the test of the stone was, but he knew a challenge when he heard one. All he saw was the look on Chayton's face, a flicker of fear, not for herself, but for him. In that moment, something shifted inside him. For the first time in 10 years, he felt the protective instinct of a man with something to lose. He nodded slowly, his eyes locked on the chief. "I'll do it." The test was a brutal, simple thing. A heavy, smooth riverstone, almost perfectly round, was placed on a flat rock. 2 men would stand on opposite sides and, on the chief's command, strike it with their bare fists. It was not a test of strength, but of will and endurance. The stone did not break. The men did. Eagle Talon went first, his fist striking the stone with a sickening crack of bone and flesh. He grimaced, but showed no other sign of pain. Then it was Caleb's turn. He looked at the stone, then at Chayton. He thought of the war, of the men he had watched die, of the crushing weight of the life he had led. He poured all of his regret, all of his solitude, all of his unspoken pain into his fist. When he struck the rock, a shockwave of agony shot up his arm, but it felt like a release. He straightened up, his hand throbbing and likely broken, but his gaze was steady. They went back and forth, the sound of fist on stone echoing through the silent canyon. With every blow, Caleb felt a piece of his hardened shell breaking away. He was no longer fighting for pride, but for the quiet respect he saw growing in Chayton's eyes.
The canyon held its breath. The only sound was the sharp, percussive crack of flesh and bone against unyielding stone, a grim drumbeat marking the passage of pain. Eagle Talon was young, his strength a raw and explosive force. He struck with the fury of a man defending his pride. But Caleb's strength was different. It was the tempered steel of endurance, forged in the fires of a solitude and sorrow the young brave could not comprehend. Each time his fist met the stone, it was not just a physical impact, but an act of penance. He was not trying to break the stone. He was trying to break the man he had been. Eagle Talon began to falter. A thin sheen of sweat covered his brow, and his strikes became less precise, fueled now by desperation instead of fury. Caleb, however, seemed to draw strength from the pain. His movements were economical, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the stone. He was chipping away at the walls he had built around his own heart. He saw Chayton watching, her hands clasped, her expression a maelstrom of fear, hope, and a dawning understanding. She was not just watching a test of endurance. She was witnessing the painful rebirth of a man's soul. Finally, after a blow that sent a shudder through his entire body, Eagle Talon staggered back. He looked at his hand, a swollen and broken ruin. He could not lift it again. He met Caleb's gaze, and in the white man's eyes he saw not triumph, but a deep, sorrowful respect. With a guttural cry of frustration and shame, Eagle Talon turned and stalked away into the darkness, defeated. Silence descended upon the camp. Chief Blackhawk stepped forward and placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, the one that wasn't throbbing with agony. "Your honor is proven," the chief declared, his voice ringing with finality. "The debt is paid. My daughter is released from her vow." Later, in the quiet of his tent, Chayton came to him. She moved with the silent grace that was her way, carrying the basket of remedies. This time it was not his tired muscles she tended to, but the mangled flesh of his hand. Her touch was feather-light, her focus absolute. She cleaned the wounds, applied a soothing poultice of crushed yucca root, and bound his hand with practiced efficiency. Neither of them spoke of the test, or of the chief's declaration. The words were unnecessary. The space between them had changed. The formal debt had been paid, but a new, unspoken connection had taken its place. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she tied off the bandage. "He insulted your honor," Caleb said simply, his voice low. He looked at her, truly seeing her not as a debt or a duty, but as a woman whose quiet strength mirrored that of the mountains around them. "And that was a debt I felt the need to pay." He had come to this canyon a ghost, a man running from his past. He had lived for 10 years believing that to care for nothing was to be safe from pain. He now knew it was just another word for being dead. She finished her work and made to leave, but hesitated at the tent flap. She turned back, and in the soft lantern light he saw a vulnerability in her eyes that had not been there before. "The chief has released me from my vow. The debt is paid. I do not have to return." She held his gaze, and the unspoken question hung in the air more powerful than any words. It was a question about choice, about a future not dictated by honor or duty, but by the quiet, hesitant beating of two lonely hearts. He rose slowly, his bound hand held carefully at his side. He walked to her, stopping so close he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. He had spent 10 years building a fortress of solitude, and with a single look she had torn it down. He thought of the long, empty years behind him and the uncertain trail ahead.
For the first time, the thought of that trail did not feel like a sentence of loneliness, but an invitation. "I know you don't have to," he said, his voice softer than he had heard it in years. He reached out with his good hand, not to hold her, but to gently touch a single, stray feather in her braided hair. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Chetan's lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was like watching the sun rise over the canyon rim after a long, dark night. "I am a healer," she said softly, "and I believe your wounds will take a very long time to mend." She did not leave. She stayed. And in the quiet of the canvas tent, surrounded by the spirits of the ancient land, a trapper who had forgotten how to live, and the healer who understood the deepest wounds of the soul, began the slow, patient work of building a new life, not on the shifting sands of debt and honor, but on the solid rock of a choice freely made.